Good afternoon. Welcome to Prove Me Wrong, Episode 2. Thank you very much for being here today. Before I get into the topic of this week, I'm going to address the winners of the topic of last week, which was vegetarians versus carnivores. So first up, we had Emily Henry. She brought up the fact that birds were actually excluded from the ethical killings, which I brought up how all animals are killed in an ethical manner before they, in order for us to eat meat. Apparently birds are not included in that, so something I didn't know. Thank you very much, Emily, for that. And she cited the humanesociety.org as her resource. And then I had both Andy-san and Sarah Tiab, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing those correctly. They both brought up the amount of resources necessary to sustain a long-term carnivorous diet globally, or when it comes down to country by country. Apparently it takes a lot more resources to actively have a carnivorous diet as opposed to just processing, shipping everything from vegetarians. So thank you to all three of you. The reason I chose 3 this time is because we only had 3 commenters, but after the first week I'm not surprised, and I'm actually really happy that all 3 of them decided to take the time out of their day to comment. So, on to topic number 2. So in this week's episode, I'm setting out to prove why this doesn't equal this. Yeah, we're going to be talking about violent video games, and I'm taking the stance that violent video games do not directly correlate to violent crimes out in the real world. You may not like my opinions, you may not think that I'm right, but hey, that's why we're here in the first place, because you have to prove me wrong. Having grown up in Colorado, I naturally remember exactly where I was when the Columbine shootings took place. As a direct result of that horrible, horrible tragedy, a lot of people started bringing up the argument that video games were to blame. They said, well, these 2 gunmen, they played violent video games, so therefore there has to be a direct causal relation between violent video games and violent crimes. The Entertainment Software Association in 1999 actually conducted a 10-year research going from 1996 to 2007. During this 10-year study, they were tasked with trying to find a direct link to violence in video games and violent crimes in the United States. In 1996, there was just over 2 million violent crimes in the United States of America, and the annual sales total of the video game industry was hovering just around $2.5 billion annually. In 2007, 10 years later, the video game industry boomed. It exploded. And it almost quadrupled in sales. It was hovering at around $9.5 billion annually in 2007. The only thing is, violent crimes in the United States actually dropped to just under 1.5 million in the United States of that year. So right there, you have a direct increase in video game sales and a direct decrease in violent crimes in the United States. I could just sit here for the next 2 minutes and twiddle my thumbs. In my mind, I've already won this argument, but I'm not gonna. It's really interesting to think what Oxford University has to say on the subject of violence in video games. Take Dr. Andrew Przybyłski, for instance. He's an experimental psychologist at Oxford. He actually conducted numerous experiments and studies on video game violence and their direct link, if any, to violence in children around the world. He said, all observed behaviors were very small in magnitude, suggesting only a minor relationship at best, and that games do not have as large an impact as some parents and practitioners worry. He also found that kids who play video games for an hour or less every day were more likely to be less aggressive and rated better behaved by their teachers. So now we're going from one end of the spectrum that violence in video games causes violence in children to the other end where violence in video games causes better behaved children. So you remember that study that I brought up earlier that went from 1996 to 2007 and how it didn't really show any links between violence in video games and violent crimes? Well, this next study I'm going to tell you about goes even longer, from 1996 to 2011, and it found even less direct links between violent video games and violence in real life. The ESRB, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, conducted a study from 1996 to 2011, like I said, and it found that the youth violence drops precipitously despite maintaining very high levels of media violence in society. Now I'm just going to start throwing numbers at you, alright, to wind up my argument for this week. The arrest rate for juveniles between 1996 and 2011 fell, the arrest for juvenile murders fell 71.9% in those 15 years. Now, all juvenile arrests and violent crimes dropped 49.3% during that 15-year period. The Secret Service even conducted a review on every single school shooting out there, and it actually found that 1 out of every 8 shooters will take an interest in violent video games. The majority of the shooters, of the attackers, are going to take more of an interest in violent movies, violent books, violent music, or violence in their own writings and imagination. So, movies, music, books, own imagination, and then way down here, you have video games. Alright, well that wraps us up today and Prove Me Wrong. Thank you very much for stopping by, I really do appreciate it. Can't wait to read everyone's comments. As you slowly see, we're starting to ramp everything up to more serious and hard-hitting topics, so really hope you start sticking around week by week. Go ahead and follow us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter. I don't even think I have a Twitter, but I'm going to have to get one now. Other than that, guys, have a wonderful weekend. Can't wait to see you again next week. Later.